47 minutes into a phone call with his father, a 19-year-old college student walking through the darkness of rural Minnesota suddenly said two words, "Oh, shit." And then he was gone, swallowed whole by the endless farmland. And despite one of the most extensive searches in the state's history, not a single trace of Brandon Swanson has ever been found. Before we dive into this haunting story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if cases where someone vanishes mid-conversation stay with you long after the screen fades to black, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we uncover another mystery that demands to be remembered. To understand what happened on the night of May 14, 2008, you first need to understand southwestern Minnesota. This is not the Minnesota of lakes and forests that most people picture. This is prairie country, flat and vast and utterly unforgiving. The land stretches to the horizon in every direction, an endless patchwork of fields planted with corn and soybeans, interrupted only by the occasional farmhouse, grain elevator, or ribbon of gravel road. In May, before the crops have grown tall, you can see for miles. But at night, under a quarter moon, with no street lights to guide you, this landscape becomes something else entirely. It becomes a place where distances deceive, where the lights of one town look identical to those of another, where a wrong turn can send you 20 miles in the wrong direction without you ever realizing it. The towns out here are small. Marshall, the county seat of Lyon County, has a population of roughly 13,000. The surrounding communities, Lind, Porter, Taunton, Minneota, are barely dots on the map, with populations measured in dozens or hundreds. The roads connecting them are mostly gravel, poorly marked, and virtually indistinguishable from one another in the dark. It was into this landscape that Brandon Victor Swanson drove on the night of May 13th, 2008, and from which he would never return. Brandon was born on January 30th, 1989, in Marshall, Minnesota. He was the older of two children born to Brian and Annette Swanson, with a younger sister named Jamin. By all accounts, he was a normal, well-adjusted young man who had never given his parents any serious cause for concern. He graduated from Marshall High School in 2007, a year before his disappearance. Unlike many of his classmates who immediately headed off to four-year universities, Brandon chose a more practical path. He enrolled in Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, about 30 miles northwest of Marshall, to study wind energy and turbine technology. It was a growing field, and Brandon saw a future in it. Those who knew Brandon described him as friendly, intelligent, and responsible. He had worked at the local Hy-Vee grocery store for 4 years before his disappearance. He loved to read. He was close to his family and had a wide circle of friends. He was not the type to disappear without a word, not the type to run away, not the type to put his parents through unnecessary worry. There was one detail about Brandon that would later prove significant. Due to a childhood injury, he was legally blind in his left eye. This condition affected his depth perception, particularly in low-light conditions. He wore glasses to help compensate, though they couldn't fully correct the problem. On May 13, 2008, a Tuesday, Brandon's first year at Minnesota West came to an end. Classes concluded for the academic year. For college students everywhere, this marked a time of celebration, and Brandon was no exception. That evening, he attended at least 2 different gatherings with friends and fellow students in the area. The first was in Canby, near his college. The second was elsewhere in the region. Accounts vary on the exact location. At both parties, Brandon was observed drinking alcohol, though Multiple witnesses would later tell investigators that he did not appear to be heavily intoxicated. "He seemed fine," one friend recalled. "He was having a good time, but he wasn't drunk." This assessment would later prove important. Whatever happened to Brandon that night, the evidence suggests it was not the result of severe intoxication, impairing his judgment to a dangerous degree. Sometime after midnight, the exact time varies slightly depending on the source, but most accounts place it between midnight and 12:30 a.m. Brandon left the gathering in Canby to drive home to Marshall. The direct route would have been Highway 68, a straight shot that would have taken approximately 30 minutes. But for reasons that have never been fully explained, Brandon did not take Highway 68. Instead, he turned onto the back roads, the network of gravel routes that crisscross the rural landscape between the small towns of southwestern Minnesota. Why did he make this choice? Some have speculated that he was trying to avoid potential police patrols on the main highway, concerned about being pulled over after drinking. Others have suggested he simply wanted to take a more scenic route, enjoying the solitude of a late-night drive. Still others believe he may have become confused about his location early on and inadvertently taken a wrong turn. Whatever the reason, this decision would prove fateful. The gravel roads of rural Minnesota are not designed for easy navigation. They are laid out in a grid pattern, running north-south and east-west, with intersections spaced approximately 1 mile apart. In daylight, with good visibility, they present few challenges. But at night, with no distinguishing landmarks and no streetlights, they become a maze where one road looks identical to every other. At approximately 1:54 a.m. on May 14, 2008, Brandon's green Chevrolet Lumina sedan left the road and became stuck in a ditch. The car was not damaged. Brandon was not injured. He had simply misjudged the edge of the road in the darkness, a common occurrence on these narrow gravel routes, and driven into an incline steep enough to lift the wheels off the ground and prevent him from getting traction. Brandon tried calling his friends for help, but no one answered at that late hour. So he did what any responsible young man would do in that situation. He called his parents. Brian and Annette Swanson were awoken by the phone call. Their son explained the situation. He was stuck in a ditch on a gravel road. He was fine, just needed a ride home. He told them he was pretty sure he was near Lind, a small town about 7 miles southwest of Marshall. He said he would wait with the car until they arrived. Brian and Annette got into their pickup truck and headed out into the night to retrieve their son. They stayed on the phone with Brandon as they drove, trying to coordinate their efforts to find him. What happened over the next 47 minutes would become one of the most analyzed and debated phone calls in the history of missing persons cases. Brian and Annette drove to the area Brandon had described, the vicinity of Lind, southwest of Marshall. When they arrived, they began looking for his car. Brandon said he would flash his headlights to help them locate him. "We're flashing our lights," Annette said into the phone. "Do you see us?" "No," Brandon replied. "Do you see me? I'm flashing mine, too." They couldn't see each other. The parents drove up and down the roads near Lind, flashing their lights, calling out Brandon's name. Brandon remained in his car, flashing his lights in response. Neither party could spot the other. This went on for several minutes, growing increasingly frustrating for everyone involved. At one point, the tension boiled over, and Brandon hung up on his mother. She immediately called back, and they both apologized for getting short with each other. It was during this call that the first crucial detail emerged. Brandon told his parents, that since they couldn't find him, he would start walking toward town. He said he could see lights in the distance that he believed were Lind, and he would head in that direction. He told them to meet him at the parking lot of a local bar and grill. His parents agreed. Annette went back home while Brian continued searching. Father and son remained on the phone as Brandon began his walk through the darkness. For the next 47 minutes, Brandon walked through the rural Minnesota night, talking to his father on his cell phone. He described what he was seeing: gravel roads, fields, fences. At one point, he mentioned hearing water nearby. At another point, he complained about having to climb over fences as he took shortcuts across the farmland. Brandon Swanson would later recall that his son sounded coherent throughout the conversation. There was no slurring, no confusion, no indication that Brandon was impaired to any significant degree. He was simply lost in the darkness, trying to find his way to safety. Then, 47 minutes into the call, something happened. "Not another fence," Brandon said, according to some accounts. And then, "Oh, shit." The words came suddenly, without warning. Brian waited for his son to explain what had happened. He assumed Brandon had tripped, perhaps stumbled, in the darkness. He called out Brandon's name, waiting for a response. But no response came. The phone went silent. Not disconnected. Silent. Brian remained on the line, calling his son's name, hoping to hear something, but there was only silence. After several agonizing moments, Brian hung up and tried to call back. The phone rang, but Brandon didn't answer. He tried again, and again. Each time, the phone rang through to voicemail. It was approximately 2:30 in the morning. Brandon Swanson had vanished mid-sentence, mid-conversation, mid-step. He has never been heard from again. Brian and Annette Swanson continued searching through the night, driving the dark, gravel roads, calling out their son's name into the empty farmland. Brandon's friends joined the search when they learned what had happened. They covered mile after mile of rural terrain, finding nothing. At 6:30 a.m., with no sign of Brandon and no response to their calls, Annette Swanson contacted the Lynn Police Department to report her son missing. The response she received would later become a catalyst for changing Minnesota law. The officer who took her call was not particularly concerned. He pointed out that it was hardly unusual for a 19-year-old to stay out all night after the last day of college classes. Young men that age sometimes did that sort of thing. One phrase, in particular, stuck with Annette and would haunt her for years to come. The officer told her that at his age, Brandon had a right to be missing. "I'm his mother," Annette would later recall saying. "I knew something was horribly wrong." But the official search did not begin in earnest for several more hours. It was not until later that morning, when police obtained Brandon's cell phone records, that the true dimensions of the mystery began to emerge. Brandon had told his parents he was near Lind, southwest of Marshall. His cell phone records told a very different story. The records showed that Brandon's calls had been routed through a cell tower near Taunton and Porter, approximately 25 miles northwest of Lind, in almost the opposite direction from where he believed he was. Brandon had been utterly disoriented, convinced he was in one place when he was actually somewhere else entirely. This discovery shifted the entire search. Police began focusing their efforts on the Taunton-Porter area, and at approximately 12:30 p.m. on May 14th, roughly 10 hours after Brandon disappeared, they located his car. The green Chevrolet Lumina was found in a ditch off a gravel road about a mile and a half north of Highway 68, right on the border between Lincoln and Lyon counties. The car was undamaged, sitting on an incline steep enough to have prevented Brandon from getting traction, but not enough to cause any harm. Sheriff Jack Vizecki of Lincoln County described the scene. It was off the side of a field approach, and the vehicle was hung up. Sort of a sharp incline. Nothing major, but enough that the car would get hung up, so the wheels are too high off the ground to gain traction. Inside the car, investigators found Brandon's glasses, the ones he needed due to his partial blindness. Why he had left them behind, particularly given that he was walking through unfamiliar terrain in the dark, remains one of the enduring mysteries of the case. The car was unlocked. Brandon's keys were missing, presumably taken with him when he began his walk. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of foul play, nothing to suggest that anything criminal had occurred at the vehicle. But Brandon himself was nowhere to be found. What became clear immediately was the magnitude of Brandon's disorientation. He had believed he was near Lind, about 7 miles from his home in Marshall. In reality, he was near Porter and Taunton, more than 20 miles in the opposite direction. When he saw lights in the distance and began walking toward them, he wasn't walking toward Lind at all. He was walking toward Taunton, or perhaps toward the red light atop a grain elevator that was visible from the area. Sheriff Joel Dahl of Lyon County noted this detail. The red light could easily have been mistaken for a town's lights in the distance, leading Brandon to believe he was much closer to civilization than he actually was. The search that followed was one of the most extensive in Minnesota history. Hundreds of volunteers fanned out across the rural landscape. Trained search dogs were brought in from South Dakota. Aerial surveillance scanned the fields from above. Boats were deployed along the Yellow Medicine River, which ran through the area. Gates were installed in the river to catch anything that might float downstream. The bloodhounds from Codington County, South Dakota, picked up a scent trail that would become central to the investigation. From Brandon's car, the dogs followed a path half a mile south, then turned west onto a road called 390th Street. They continued for about a mile before turning north onto County Road 16. The trail then led to the driveway of an abandoned farm before roughly following the course of the Yellow Medicine River to the northwest. At one point, one of the bloodhounds jumped into the Yellow Medicine River, then jumped back out and continued tracking along the opposite bank. The dog's handler interpreted this as possibly indicating that Brandon had fallen into the river at that point and managed to climb back out. But the trail didn't end at the river. It continued north along another gravel road toward the Yellow Medicine County line, where it finally ended. The dogs lost the scent, and with it, the most promising lead in the case. What did the scent trail mean? Had Brandon walked this entire route before something happened to him? Had he indeed fallen into the river and crawled out, only to continue walking until he succumbed to hypothermia or some other fate? Or had he encountered something or someone along the way? The river became an early focus of the investigation. The Yellow Medicine River was running high and fast in mid-May 2008, swollen with spring snowmelt. Some investigators theorized that Brandon had fallen in, drowned, and been carried downstream. But extensive searches of the river turned up nothing. No body, no clothing, no personal items. Divers searched the water. Boats patrolled the surface. Excavators later dug into areas where the water had receded. Nothing was ever found. Annette Swanson never believed her son drowned in the river. "There really is nothing to indicate that he's in the river," she told CNN in an interview. The dog's behavior, jumping in and then out, then continuing to follow the scent on the other side, suggested Brandon had been in the water but had gotten out. Other theories emerged. The area where Brandon disappeared was dotted with abandoned wells and cisterns, relics of farms that had been built and abandoned over the decades. These unmarked hazards, sometimes covered only by rotting wooden boards, could be death traps for someone walking through the darkness without knowing they were there. Had Brandon stepped on a deteriorated cistern cover and fallen through? Was he lying at the bottom of some forgotten well, his body hidden from view? Searchers looked for such hazards, but finding them all in an area of more than 120 square miles proved impossible. The landscape was simply too vast, and many of these structures had been forgotten by everyone, except perhaps the farmers who owned the land. Speaking of farmers, one of the most frustrating aspects of the search was the resistance from some landowners. Many were cooperative, allowing search teams and dogs onto their property. But others refused, particularly cattle farmers, who didn't want strange dogs upsetting their livestock. One canine team picked up Brandon's scent on a piece of farm equipment, but the owner refused to allow a fuller search of his property. Without evidence of a crime, police could not obtain a warrant to force access. These gaps in the search area have haunted investigators and the Swanson family for years. Could Brandon's remains be on one of those unsearched properties? Could the answer to what happened to him be lying in a field or a barn that searchers were never allowed to enter? The temperature on the night Brandon disappeared was in the low 40s. Cold, but not immediately dangerous for someone in good health. However, if Brandon had fallen into the river, gotten wet, and then continued walking in the cold night air, hypothermia would have become a serious threat. The theory developed by many searchers was that Brandon had indeed fallen into the Yellow Medicine River, managed to get out, and continued walking while wet and increasingly hypothermic. As hypothermia progresses, it causes confusion and disorientation. In severe cases, victims sometimes engage in what's called paradoxical undressing, removing their clothes because they feel hot even as their body temperature plummets. Could Brandon have walked some distance from the river, become increasingly confused, and eventually collapsed somewhere on the vast prairie? Could his body be lying in some remote field, hidden by crops or vegetation, waiting to be found? If so, why has no trace of him ever been discovered? By 2011, more than 122 square miles had been searched. Hundreds of volunteers had donated thousands of hours. Multiple canine teams had scoured the area. Aerial drones and helicopters had surveyed the landscape from above. Yet not a single piece of evidence pointing to Brandon's fate had been recovered. No body, no clothing, no phone, no wallet, no keys. Not a single item that Brandon had been carrying that night has ever been found. This absence of evidence has led some to consider darker possibilities. What if Brandon didn't simply wander off and meet with an accident? What if someone picked him up on that lonely road? Someone who meant him harm? Sheriff Wydzecki acknowledged that he could not rule out foul play. Someone could have been in the shadows, he speculated, and they got him that way. Brandon was walking through isolated farmland in the middle of the night, alone and lost. He would have been vulnerable to anyone with malicious intent. A car approaching on those empty roads might have seemed like a godsend, someone offering help, offering a ride. Brandon might have gotten in willingly, never suspecting the danger. But there is no evidence to support this theory. No witnesses, no suspicious vehicles, no tips pointing to a specific perpetrator. It remains speculation, one possibility among many in a case that has generated far more questions than answers. Another theory that has been largely dismissed but occasionally surfaces is that Brandon staged his own disappearance. Perhaps he wanted to start a new life somewhere else, escape some pressure or problem that no one knew about. His parents reject this theory completely. "We were very close," Brandon Swanson said. "That's not something he would have done." Brandon had plans for the future. He was about to complete his certification program with prospects for a good career in a growing field. He had no known problems, no debts, no legal troubles, no reason to vanish. Moreover, the circumstances of his disappearance make voluntary flight extremely implausible. He was lost, stuck, and actively trying to get home when he disappeared. His final words, "Oh shit," suggest surprise and alarm, not a staged exit. No, Brandon Swanson did not choose to disappear. Something happened to him that night. Something sudden and unexpected. The question is what? The lack of answers took a devastating toll on the Swanson family. But rather than retreat into their grief, Brian and Annette channeled their pain into action. They were appalled by the initial response to Brandon's disappearance, the dismissive attitude, the delay in beginning the search. The officers remarked that their adult son had a right to be missing. They knew that those lost hours might have made a difference. They knew that other families would face the same obstacles if nothing changed. Annette began meeting with state legislators, telling Brandon's story, advocating for changes to Minnesota law. She found a sympathetic ear in Marty Seifert, who was then the minority leader of the Minnesota House of Representatives and whose district included Marshall. She knew it wouldn't help in her son's case, Seifert later recalled, but that it could help others in the future. Together, they crafted a piece of legislation that would become known as Brandon's Law. The bill required law enforcement agencies to immediately take reports of missing adults and begin investigations without delay. It prohibited officers from refusing to take a report based on the person's age, the length of time they had been missing, or the assumption that no crime had occurred. It established standardized procedures for missing persons cases statewide and clarified jurisdictional responsibilities when multiple agencies were involved. The bill passed the Minnesota House unanimously. The Senate followed suit. On May 7, 2009, almost exactly a year after Brandon's disappearance, Governor Tim Pawlenty signed Brandon's Law into law, with Brian, Annette, and Jamin Swanson in attendance. The law took effect on July 1, 2009. 4 other states have since passed similar legislation inspired by Brandon's case. "This is a bittersweet moment for us," Annette said at the signing ceremony. "We want to make a difference for the people." The irony was not lost on anyone. Brandon's Law came too late to help Brandon, but it would help others, future families who found themselves in the nightmare of a missing loved one, families who would now receive the immediate response that the Swansons had been denied. The porch light at the Swanson home in Marshall has been on continuously since May 14, 2008. Brian replaces the bulb immediately whenever it burns out. By one count, Brandon has been missing for more than a dozen light bulbs. The light stays on all night, every night, a beacon for a son who never came home. "We're leaving it on till he comes home," Annette has said. It is a simple gesture, but it speaks to the profound grief of parents who have never been able to bury their child, never been able to hold a funeral, never been able to achieve any sense of closure. They call it ambiguous loss, Annette explained in an interview. It's that state in your life, in our case, the loss of our son, without knowing what happened. It's extremely challenging. It's really hard to grapple with and to come to terms with. I think for Brandon's father and I, and for his sister, we've kind of figured out how to live in that gray area. But it's really not someplace you want to live. The not knowing is perhaps the cruelest aspect of cases like Brandon's. Did he die quickly, or did he suffer? Did he know what was happening to him, or was he taken by surprise? Is he somewhere out there, his body waiting to be found, or has he been lost forever? These questions torment the Swanson family every day. At night, when you're lying awake in bed, you think, well, maybe there's that chance, Brian has said. But then you think, if he was out there, he'd be home now, or at least have gotten in contact with us. He wouldn't have just run off. There's no way. The official searches have largely ended, but the Swanson family has never stopped looking. Volunteer organizations continue to work the case, returning to the area periodically with cadaver dogs and specialized equipment. Every few years, when drought or other conditions cause water levels to drop, searchers return to the rivers and creeks, hoping that exposed terrain will reveal what has been hidden. In 2010, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension took over as the lead agency on the case. They established a tip line that has received approximately 90 leads over the years, though none has produced a breakthrough. As the years have passed, the search has become increasingly difficult. Scent evidence degrades over time, making it harder for dogs to track. Witnesses' memories fade. The landscape itself changes as farms are sold, fields are replanted, and structures are built or demolished. The problem is that, as time goes on, it becomes much more complicated to fulfill the search because you need to have canines that have experience in aged scent, explained Ken Anderson of Emergency Support Services, one of the organizations that has continued to work on Brandon's case. In the whole state of Minnesota, there have been no more than 3 dogs available at any given time with the capability for this kind of search. Despite these challenges, the search continues. Canine teams still periodically pick up scent in the area. Possibly Brandon's, possibly not. Each detection renews hope that the answer might be near, that the next search might finally bring closure. As long as that scent is still there, we have something to work with, Anderson has said. What happened to Brandon Swanson? After more than 17 years, several theories remain. The most widely accepted is the river and hypothermia theory. Brandon fell into the Yellow Medicine River, managed to climb out, and continued walking while wet and increasingly hypothermic. Eventually, he collapsed somewhere in the vast farmland, his body hidden by crops or vegetation never to be found. This theory explains the scent trail, the dog's behavior at the river, the continuation of the trail on the other side, and its eventual disappearance. It explains the "oh shit" exclamation, the moment of shock as he fell into the cold water. And it explains the silence that followed, his phone getting wet or being dropped, making it impossible to call back. But it doesn't explain why his body has never been found. The area has been searched extensively. Farmers walk their fields regularly. If Brandon's remains were lying in a field, someone should have found them by now. Another theory holds that Brandon fell into an abandoned well or cistern. These unmarked hazards dot the rural landscape, some covered only by rotting boards that might collapse under a person's weight. If Brandon stepped on such a cover in the darkness, he could have plunged into a shaft from which there was no escape. This would explain why his body has never been found. It would be at the bottom of a forgotten hole, invisible from the surface. But it would require the well to be located somewhere other than where the scent trail led, since dogs tracked Brandon's movement for some distance from his car. A third theory suggests foul play. Brandon was vulnerable that night, alone, lost, walking on dark roads in an isolated area. He could have encountered someone with harmful intentions, someone who offered help and delivered violence instead. This theory has no direct evidence to support it, but it cannot be ruled out. Brandon's complete disappearance, no body, no clothing, no personal items, is consistent with a scenario in which someone deliberately concealed evidence of a crime. The final possibility is one the Swanson family refuses to accept, but that some have suggested that Brandon is still alive somewhere, having chosen to disappear and start a new life. There is no evidence for this theory, and everything known about Brandon contradicts it. He was not troubled, not running from anything, not the type of person who would put his family through decades of agony for no reason. The idea that he staged his disappearance is, by all reasonable analysis, not credible. The truth is that we do not know what happened to Brandon Swanson. We may never know. His case remains officially open, classified as a missing person investigation with no resolution in sight. In the years since Brandon's disappearance, the world has changed. Technology has advanced. GPS tracking is now standard on smartphones. It is unlikely that a person could become as disoriented as Brandon was in 2008 with the navigation tools available today. But in May 2008, those tools were not widely available. Cell phone tracking could identify the nearest tower, but not a precise location. There was no way for Brandon's parents to simply share their location and pinpoint exactly where they were relative to their son. The case has also highlighted the limitations of search and rescue in rural areas. More than 120 square miles were searched, but gaps remained. Properties where searchers were not allowed, hazards that were never located, terrain that was simply too vast to cover completely. Brandon's law addressed one problem: the bureaucratic delays that prevented a quick response. But it could not address the fundamental challenge of finding someone in a landscape as vast and unforgiving as southwestern Minnesota's prairie. If you are watching this, there is something you can do. Brandon Swanson's case remains open. The Lincoln County Sheriff's Office continues to accept tips at 507-694-1664. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension maintains a tip line as well. Any information, no matter how small it might seem, could be the piece that finally solves this puzzle. Someone out there may know something. A farmer may have noticed something unusual on their property in May 2008. A motorist may have seen something that night. A piece of information that seemed insignificant at the time might, in retrospect, be the key to the truth. Brandon's parents have asked only one thing: that their son not be forgotten, that people continue to speak his name, share his story, and hold out hope that someday, perhaps today, perhaps years from now, the answer will finally emerge. "I want people to remember him," Annette has said. "He touched a lot of lives. He had a smile that lit up his whole face. He was big-hearted and kind and believed in doing the right thing." She has also offered advice to others, born from her years of living in the gray area of not knowing. We were just an ordinary family going about our ordinary days. Never did we think that our world would change so drastically. Treasure what you have every single day and hug the people you love. The porch light is still on at the Swanson home. It has been on for more than 17 years now, a steady glow visible from the street, waiting for someone who may never return. Brandon Swanson was 19 years old when he disappeared. He would be 36 today. His friends have grown up, started careers, gotten married, had children. His sister Jameen has lived her adult life in the shadow of her brother's absence. His parents have grown older, their hair graying, their faces marked by years of grief that has no resolution. The fields around Taunton and Porter still stretch to the horizon, vast and flat and unforgiving. The Yellow Medicine River still flows northwest toward its junction with the Minnesota River. The gravel roads still crisscross the landscape, indistinguishable from one another in the darkness. Somewhere in that landscape, perhaps in the river, perhaps in an abandoned well, perhaps in a field, perhaps somewhere no one has thought to look, Brandon Swanson may be waiting to be found. Or perhaps he is somewhere else entirely, taken by someone who has never been identified, his fate known only to his killer. We do not know. We may never know. But we continue to ask the question, continue to search for answers, continue to hope that someday the truth will emerge from the darkness of that May night in 2008. Brandon Swanson mattered. He was a son, a brother, a friend. He had plans and dreams and a future that was stolen from him. He deserved better than to vanish into the night, leaving his family with nothing but questions. If you have any information about Brandon Swanson, please come forward. Speak to the authorities. Help bring closure to a family that has waited far too long. And if you are out there somewhere, Brandon, your porch light is still on. Your family is still waiting. They have never stopped hoping that you will come home. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering Brandon Swanson. Until next time, stay safe and hold your loved ones close. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Brandon Swanson, please contact the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office at 507-694-4 or the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension tip line at 877-996-6222. The landscape where Brandon vanished deserves closer examination because understanding the terrain helps explain why the search has been so difficult. Southwestern Minnesota is farm country, and in May 2008, the spring planting season was in full swing. Fields that had been bare stubble in April were being transformed into neat rows of corn and soybeans. The crops would grow tall over the summer, reaching heights of 6 feet or more by August, creating walls of vegetation that could conceal almost anything. The timing of Brandon's disappearance could not have been worse from a search perspective. Within weeks of May 14th, the fields where he may have walked became increasingly difficult to search. By midsummer, they were virtually impenetrable. Searchers had to wait until harvest in the fall to fully cover the terrain, by which point months had passed and evidence may have been disturbed or destroyed. This agricultural cycle has shaped the search ever since. Major search efforts have been concentrated in the spring, after snowmelt but before planting, and in the fall, after harvest but before winter sets in. During the growing season, large portions of the search area are simply inaccessible. The Yellow Medicine River, which has been central to so many theories about Brandon's fate, is not a large waterway by most standards. In normal conditions, it's shallow enough to wade across in many places. But in May 2008, fed by spring snowmelt and recent rains, it was running higher and faster than usual. Sheriff Dahl noted that in some areas of Lincoln County, the water had been 10 feet deep on the morning of Brandon's disappearance, though levels dropped in subsequent days. This timing raises troubling questions. If Brandon fell into the river that night, he would have encountered it at its most dangerous. By the time searchers arrived, the water had receded, potentially carrying any evidence downstream. The Yellow Medicine flows northwest, eventually joining the Minnesota River near Granite Falls, about 40 miles from where Brandon disappeared. Theoretically, a body that entered the river near Porter could have been carried a considerable distance before coming to rest. But extensive searches of the river and its banks, extending well downstream, found nothing. Boats from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources were deployed in the days following Brandon's disappearance. Gates were installed at strategic points to catch any debris that might float downstream. Divers explored the deeper sections of the river. Sonar equipment was used to scan the riverbed. Nothing. In the years since, periods of drought have caused water levels to drop significantly, exposing portions of the riverbed that are normally submerged. Each time this has happened, searchers have returned, hoping that receding waters will reveal what was previously hidden. Excavators have dug into the mud and silt, looking for bones, clothing, or personal effects. Nothing. The search has also focused on Mud Creek, a tributary of the Yellow Medicine that runs north and northwest of Porter. Cadaver dogs have indicated the presence of human remains in this area on multiple occasions, but follow-up searches have never located a body. The dogs' responses could indicate Brandon's presence, or they could be responding to something else entirely: animal remains, decomposing vegetation, or other organic matter. The science of cadaver dog detection is not exact. These animals are trained to identify the scent of human decomposition, but they can make mistakes. A positive indication is a lead, not proof. And in Brandon's case, the leads have never led to anything conclusive. Sheriff Jack Vizecki of Lincoln County walked the 2-mile stretch of the Yellow Medicine River in the search area every day for 30 consecutive days after Brandon's disappearance. He was personally invested in finding the young man, convinced that the answer was out there somewhere. But despite his dedication, he found nothing. It's a huge area, Yellow Medicine County Sheriff Bill Flatten would later tell reporters. If you take that immediate area where the car was, and then the time frame when he was talking on the phone with his parents, who knows what direction he went and how far he traveled? This is the fundamental challenge of the Brandon Swanson case. We know where his car was found. We have a scent trail that gives us some indication of where he walked. But we don't know how far he went, in what direction, or what ultimately happened to him. The search area, though more than 120 square miles have been covered, is essentially limitless. The role of technology, or the lack of it, has been much discussed in relation to Brandon's case. In 2008, smartphones with GPS capability existed, but were not yet ubiquitous. Brandon's black Motorola SLVR was a basic cell phone that could make calls and send texts, but could not pinpoint its own location with any precision. The best investigators could do was identify which cell tower had handled his calls, which placed him within a radius of several miles. Today, a person in Brandon's situation could share their exact GPS coordinates with a tap on their screen. A worried parent could track their child's phone in real time, watching as the dot on the map moved across the landscape. The technology that might have saved Brandon's life simply didn't exist in a practical form when he needed it. This technological gap has led some to hope that advances in other areas might eventually solve the case. Genetic genealogy, the technique that has cracked numerous cold cases in recent years, would require having biological evidence to analyze. In Brandon's case, there is no crime scene, no evidence of a struggle, no biological material to test. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies have improved dramatically since 2008. These tools can detect disturbances in the soil, locate buried objects, and identify anomalies that might indicate a body. But they require knowing where to look, and in an area of 120-plus square miles, knowing where to look is exactly what investigators don't have. Aerial drones, equipped with thermal imaging and other sensors, have been used in recent search efforts. They can cover large areas quickly and identify heat signatures or unusual patterns that human searchers might miss. But thermal imaging only works when there's a temperature difference to detect, and after 17 years, any body would have long since reached ambient temperature. The cruel truth is that despite advances in technology, Brandon Swanson may never be found. The landscape where he vanished is simply too vast, too changeable, and too indifferent to human tragedy. The investigation into Brandon's disappearance has been marked by jurisdictional complexity from the very beginning. When Annette Swanson called the Lynn Police Department at 6:30 a.m. on May 14th, she was reporting her son missing based on his stated belief that he was near Lynn in Lyon County. But when cell phone records revealed that Brandon had actually been near Taunton and Porter, the search shifted to the border of Lincoln, Lyon, and Yellow Medicine counties. This meant that 3 different sheriff's offices were involved in the investigation: Lyon County under Sheriff Joel Dahl, Lincoln County under Sheriff Jack Vizecki, and Yellow Medicine County. The lack of clear protocols for which agency was in charge created confusion and coordination challenges in the critical early hours of the search. Brandon's Law addressed this problem directly. The legislation specifies that the agency taking the initial missing person report is the lead agency for the investigation, regardless of where the missing person is ultimately believed to be. This clarification was intended to prevent the kind of jurisdictional ambiguity that plagued the early stages of Brandon's case. In 2010, 2 years after Brandon's disappearance, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension took over as the lead agency. The BCA is a state-level organization with more resources and investigative capacity than any individual county sheriff's office. Their involvement signaled that Brandon's case was being treated seriously at the highest levels of law enforcement. The BCA established a dedicated tip line and began systematically following up on leads. By 2015, they had received approximately 90 tips, ranging from the plausible to the fantastical. None produced a breakthrough, but the agency continued to investigate each one. Drew Evans, Assistant Superintendent of the BCA, spoke about the case on multiple occasions. "We continue to follow up on any and all tips we receive," he said. "Our goal is the same goal as everybody else. We want to see Brandon brought home, and we want to find him. We will continue to keep this as an active investigation until we have answers." The volunteer effort in Brandon's case has been remarkable. Emergency Support Services, a search and rescue organization based in Minneapolis, became involved in late 2008 and identified a 140-square-mile area of interest. Jeff Hassa, who served as search manager, maintained a blog called The Search for Brandon Swanson that documented the ongoing efforts and kept the public informed. Ken Anderson, who co-managed the search with Hassa, brought expertise in coordinating large-scale search operations. Under their guidance, teams of volunteers, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, fanned out across the southwestern Minnesota landscape, walking fields, searching ditches, and looking for any sign of the missing young man. The searches required careful planning. Volunteers had to be trained in search techniques, organized into manageable groups, and assigned to specific areas to avoid duplication of effort. Weather conditions had to be monitored. Landowner permissions had to be obtained or noted when they were refused. More than 500 volunteers participated over the years, including 34 dog handlers from 9 different states. They spent more than 120 days in the field, covering territory methodically and thoroughly. The dedication of these volunteers, most of whom had no personal connection to Brandon or his family, speaks to something admirable in human nature: the impulse to help, to search, to refuse to give up on a missing person. Honestly, to think that Brandon is still in their minds after all these years, of course he's in ours. It's almost hard to fathom, Annette Swanson said of the volunteer effort. The amount of support the family has received from strangers and volunteers is overwhelming. The canine teams deserve special mention. Search and rescue dogs are trained to track specific scents or to detect the smell of human decomposition. Different dogs have different specialties, and the Brandon Swanson search has employed various types over the years. The initial bloodhounds from Codington County, South Dakota, established the scent trail from Brandon's car that became central to the investigation. Their work suggested a path leading to the Yellow Medicine River and beyond, giving searchers a framework for their efforts. Cadaver dogs, trained to detect human remains, have been deployed numerous times. Their indications near Mud Creek have been tantalizing but ultimately frustrating, suggesting that something might be there without ever leading to a body. As years have passed, the search has required increasingly specialized dogs, animals trained to detect aged scent, which is qualitatively different from fresh scent. Such dogs are rare. According to Ken Anderson, there have never been more than 3 in the entire state of Minnesota at any given time capable of this kind of work. The problem is that as time goes on, it becomes much more complicated to fulfill the search because you need to have canines that have experience in aged scent, Anderson explained. The longer Brandon remains missing, the harder it becomes to find him using traditional search methods. The psychological impact of Brandon's disappearance has rippled outward from his immediate family to the broader community. Marshall is a small city where people know each other. Brandon was a familiar face at the high school, at the Hy-Vee where he worked, at church, around town. His disappearance affected people who had known him for years, people who had watched him grow up. For Brandon's classmates and friends, his vanishing was a stark introduction to the fragility of life. Young people often feel invincible, certain that tragedy happens to other people. Brandon's case shattered that illusion for many of his peers. If it could happen to Brandon, responsible, cautious, ordinary Brandon, it could happen to anyone. The case has also affected the broader true crime community. Brandon Swanson's disappearance has been featured in numerous podcasts, articles, and television programs. His story has reached millions of people who never met him and never will, but who find themselves haunted by his final words and the mystery of his fate. Some have criticized the true crime industry's fascination with cases like Brandon's, arguing that it turns tragedy into entertainment. Others counter that maintaining public awareness is essential in missing persons cases, that the more people who know the story, the more likely it is that someone with information will come forward. The Swanson family has generally welcomed media attention, viewing it as a way to keep Brandon's case alive. They have given interviews, participated in documentaries, and worked with journalists to ensure that accurate information reaches the public. Their hope is that someone, somewhere, knows something, and that continued attention might prompt that person to Speak up. The question that hangs over everything is simple. What does Brandon's family hope for? In the early days and weeks, they hoped he would be found alive. Perhaps he was injured somewhere, unable to move, waiting for rescue. Perhaps he had found shelter and was surviving somehow. Perhaps there was an explanation that would bring him back to them. As weeks became months and months became years, that hope faded. Brandon Swanson has acknowledged as much. "I'm pretty sure we're not going to find him alive," he has said. "But I still want to believe that we will find him. That's probably a stretch, but I still want to believe that." What they hope for now is closure. They want to know what happened. They want to bring Brandon home, even if home means a funeral and a grave rather than a bedroom and a chair at the dinner table. They want to stop living in the gray area of not knowing. "We need to have that final saying of goodbye," Annette has said, "for family, for friends, for people who knew him and knew us and support us and love us." In 2017, Brandon Swanson was declared legally deceased, a procedural step that allowed his family to settle certain legal and financial matters. But legal death is not the same as certainty. It is a bureaucratic determination, not an answer to the question that keeps Brian and Annette awake at night. Her greatest fear, one journalist wrote of Annette Swanson, is that Brandon will be forgotten. He won't be. Not as long as people tell his story, share his name, and refuse to accept that a 19-year-old can simply vanish into the night without explanation. Brandon Victor Swanson, born January 30th, 1989. Last seen May 14th, 2008. Still missing. The porch light is still on. What can we learn from Brandon Swanson's case? What does it teach us about missing persons, about rural America, about the limits of search and rescue? First, it reminds us that disorientation can happen to anyone. Brandon was not severely intoxicated that night. He was coherent enough to have a 47-minute conversation with his father, to describe his surroundings, to navigate fences and fields. Yet he was utterly convinced he was in one place when he was actually 25 miles away. This kind of disorientation is more common than people realize, especially at night, in unfamiliar territory, under stress. The human mind looks for patterns, tries to make sense of its environment. When Brandon saw lights in the distance, his brain told him those lights must be Lind, because that's where he thought he was. Once that assumption took hold, everything else fell into place around it. He walked toward those lights with confidence, never realizing he was heading in the wrong direction entirely. Second, the case highlights the importance of staying with your vehicle. There's a reason this is standard survival advice. Your car is large, visible, and provides shelter. It's much easier for rescuers to find a car than to find a person walking through fields in the dark. Brandon didn't have the benefit of this advice when he decided to start walking. He was frustrated, cold, and eager to get home. The lights he could see seemed close enough to reach on foot. In his position, many people would have made the same choice. But that choice may have cost him his life. Third, the case underscores the vital importance of a rapid response to missing persons reports. Those lost hours between 6:30 a.m., when Annette reported Brandon missing, and later that morning, when the search finally began in earnest, might have made a difference. If Brandon was injured, those hours could have been the difference between rescue and death. If he had fallen into the river and managed to get out, those hours might have been crucial for treating hypothermia. Brandon's law addressed this issue, but it can't undo what happened in 2008. It can only prevent the same delays from affecting future families. Finally, the case raises profound questions about how we search for missing persons in rural America. The vast majority of missing persons cases occur in urban or suburban environments, where the search area is defined by roads, buildings, and other infrastructure. Search and rescue protocols are designed with these environments in mind. But rural America presents different challenges. The terrain is vast and often featureless. Private property rights limit where searchers can go. Agricultural cycles affect when searches can take place. The infrastructure that helps define search areas in urban settings simply doesn't exist. Brandon Swanson's case exposed these limitations in stark terms. More than 500 volunteers searched more than 120 square miles over more than 120 days, and they still couldn't find one young man. Not because they weren't trying, they tried heroically, but because the landscape simply wouldn't give up its secrets. What changes might help in future cases? Some have suggested creating more detailed maps of rural hazards, abandoned wells, cisterns, and other dangerous structures that could trap a person. Others have proposed establishing mutual aid agreements that would allow search teams to access private property more easily. Still others have called for more investment in specialized search technology suited to rural environments. These are policy questions without easy answers. But they are questions that Brandon's case forces us to consider. The night of May 13th and the early morning of May 14th, 2008, plays out in my imagination sometimes. I picture Brandon leaving the party in Canby, tired but happy, looking forward to getting home and sleeping in his own bed. I picture him making the fateful decision to take the back roads, perhaps singing along to music on the radio, perhaps just enjoying the quiet of a late-night drive. I picture the moment he realized his car was stuck, the frustration, the profanity, the calculation of what to do next. I picture him calling his parents, reassuring them that he was fine, just needed a ride. I picture Brian and Annette getting out of bed, pulling on clothes, climbing into their pickup truck. I picture them driving through the darkness, talking to their son on the phone, growing increasingly puzzled as they failed to find each other, despite both parties flashing their lights. I picture Brandon's growing frustration with the situation, with his parents, with himself. I picture the moment he decided to start walking, convinced he could see Lind in the distance, convinced he could solve this problem on his own. I picture him climbing over fences, crossing fields, making his way toward lights that were never Lind at all. I picture the Yellow Medicine River appearing suddenly in his path, black and cold and fast-moving in the darkness. And then I picture the moment when something went wrong. The moment when Brandon said, "Oh shit," and everything changed. What happened in that moment? Did he fall? Did he see something? Did someone emerge from the darkness? We don't know. We may never know. But I know this. Brandon Swanson was a real person, not just a case file or a true crime story. He had a family who loved him, friends who miss him, a future that was stolen from him. He was 19 years old, barely an adult, with his whole life ahead of him. He deserved better than to vanish into the Minnesota night, leaving nothing behind but questions. His parents deserved better than to spend years not knowing, years living in that gray area between hope and grief. His sister deserved better than to grow up in the shadow of her brother's absence. The world deserved better than to lose a young man who, by all accounts, was kind and hardworking and full of potential. That's what haunts me about this case. Not the mystery, not the unanswered questions, but the human cost. A family torn apart by not knowing. A community left to wonder. A young life extinguished before it really began. If you've made it this far in this video, I want to ask you something. Tell someone about Brandon Swanson. Share his story. Keep his name alive. Because as long as people remember Brandon, as long as they keep asking what happened to him, there's hope. Hope that someday someone will come forward with information. Hope that someday a search will find what has been hidden for so long. Hope that someday the Swanson family will finally get the answers they deserve. And if you're ever driving through southwestern Minnesota, through that vast flat landscape of farms and gravel roads, take a moment to think about Brandon. Think about that 19-year-old kid walking through the darkness, talking to his father on the phone, trying to find his way home. He never made it. But maybe, someday, we can bring him home. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for remembering Brandon Swanson. Stay safe out there. Hug your loved ones. And never take for granted that they'll always be there. Until next time.